In a quiet coastal town where the scent of cinnamon and warm bread drifts through empty streets, Jacob, a lonely baker with a fading smile, lives each day kneading dough and solitude. One stormy night, as rain batters the windows of his small bakery, a mysterious woman, drenched and wordless, appears at his door. He gives her shelter, a warm meal, and something rarer, kindness without question. By dawn, she's gone, leaving only a note signed A. But this isn't the end. It's the spark. The next day, the skies roar again, but this time not with thunder. A helicopter lands outside his shop. The woman returns, transformed. Amelia Rhodes, billionaire CEO, media ghost, and runaway soul, steps out to repay a debt not in dollars, but destiny. What began as a simple act of humanity turns into a journey of second chances, shared scars, and rising hope. What happens when a man who gave everything away finally gets something back? This is a story of rain-soaked nights and sky-high surprises, of healing in warm ovens and friendships baked slow. Stay with us for a tale where a cinnamon roll saved a soul, and a stranger's return changed a baker's life forever. The dawn crept in slowly, dull and gray, casting long shadows across the wooden counter of Jacob Hart's bakery. The smell of yeast and faint cinnamon hung in the air. Yesterday's remnants, not today's promise. The ovens were cold. The loaves hadn't been prepped. And Jacob stood behind the counter, hands idle for the first time in years. For 37 years, Heart and Hearth had opened its doors at 5 a.m. sharp. Rain or shine, flood or snowstorm, even on Christmas morning. But today, Jacob just stood there, staring out the foggy front window at the empty street, the neon open sign dark. He used to be the first light in this coastal town. Locals once lined up before sunrise, truck drivers, dock workers, school teachers, all waiting for his famous honey oat bread or warm cinnamon twists. But times changed. Supermarkets grew. Chains moved in, and slowly, so did silence. Jacob adjusted the sleeves of his flour-dusted cardigan and turned back to the counter. The air inside the shop was still, the kind of stillness that pressed against your ears and made your own thoughts feel too loud. He wandered to the display case. Empty. A ghost of condensation clung to the glass. A soft reminder that no pastries would greet anyone today. He didn't remember the last time he spoke to someone beyond brief pleasantries, not really. His days followed a rhythm: bake, serve, clean, sleep, repeat, a predictable loop that dulled the ache of growing older alone. The bakery had become his world, and now even that felt like it was dimming. He walked over to the back kitchen and opened the refrigerator out of habit. Rows of untouched eggs, butter, and cream stared back at him. He grabbed a jug of milk, sniffed it, still good. He set it on the counter more out of obligation than intention. Jacob wasn't sad, at least not the kind of sadness that shows in tears. He just felt faded, like a photograph left in the sun too long. A bell above the door jingled. He froze. No one ever came this early anymore. He stepped cautiously into the front room. The door was still shut. The bell, perhaps, was just a trick of wind and rusted hinges. But as he moved to check, he noticed something strange outside. The clouds had darkened suddenly, and the sky rumbled with distant thunder. A storm was rolling in. He squinted through the front window. Streets once bare were now soaked. Rain slapped the pavement in sideways gusts. The town vanished in sheets of water, the street lamps flickering like fireflies. And then there it was again. Jingle, This time it wasn't imagined. The door creaked open just enough for a figure to slip inside, soaked from head to toe, rain dripping from the ends of her tangled hair, her coat clinging to her like a second skin. She didn't speak. She simply stood there, eyes wide, breath shallow, looking not at the bakery but at him, as if unsure whether he was real. Jacob stared for a beat too long, blinking away disbelief. She was young, maybe mid-30s, though the storm had aged her in seconds. Her lips were pale, her fingers trembling, water pooled around her boots and spread across his floor. Without thinking, Jacob moved behind the counter, grabbing a clean dish towel and a heavy wool blanket he kept on hand for winter mornings. "Here," he said quietly, holding it out. She took the towel first, wrapping it around her shoulders. Then the blanket. Still, not a word. Jacob hesitated, then gestured to the small table near the oven. "Sit there. It's warmer by the heat pipe." She obeyed like someone out of fuel. The silence was thick, but not hostile. She didn't seem dangerous, just lost. He turned and busied himself, lighting the oven, putting on a pot of coffee, cracking eggs into a bowl. His hands knew the dance, and they moved before his mind could question why he was doing it. Something inside him had stirred, a long-forgotten instinct to care for someone. 20 minutes later, he placed a plate in front of her, 2 scrambled eggs, a slice of sourdough toast, and a cinnamon roll fresh from the oven. Her eyes finally met his, and for the first time in years, Jacob Hart smiled, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Jacob returned to his side of the counter, cradling his mug of black coffee like it might offer answers. Across the room, the woman ate in small, delicate bites, as though every chew had to be earned with caution. Her eyes rarely lifted from the plate, but when they did, they flickered over the bakery's surroundings with a kind of reverent curiosity, like she was cataloging safety, memorizing kindness. The rain continued its relentless drumming against the windows, drowning out the silence between them. Jacob glanced at the wall clock, nearly 7 a.m. The shop would normally be bustling by now, but not today. No one would trudge out in weather like this. Not for bread, not for anything. He cleared his throat. "You're welcome to stay till the storm passes," he said gently. "No one's coming in today anyway." She nodded once. Still no words. Jacob didn't push. He knew the language of silence. Some things were better unspoken, at least until they were ready to be heard. As she finished the last crumb of cinnamon roll, her shoulders softened just a little under the blanket. She looked lighter. The raw edge in her posture had dulled. Jacob caught the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "You from around here?" he asked, cautious but curious. She shook her head. "No." A pause. Then, in a voice as faint as the storm's distant thunder, "Just passing through." Her voice was smooth, if not a little frayed. It carried a grace he didn't expect, a hint of education, music even, buried under weariness. Jacob gave a slow nod. "Storm picked a hell of a time to chase you." She laughed, just barely, a dry chuckle under her breath. "It does that a lot." He raised an eyebrow, but didn't pry. He could have asked about her name, her story, her destination. But something told him not to, not yet. She wasn't here to be questioned. She was here because, for whatever reason, life had run her into a wall, and he had opened the door. Instead, He stood and moved to the back again, retrieving a small heater and plugging it in near her chair. The hum of the coils joined the rain in a gentle harmony. "You should get some rest," he said. "There's a cot in the back, clean linens, door stays open." She hesitated. Her gaze lingered on him, scanning for conditions, for traps, for unspoken motives. But Jacob's eyes didn't waver. They held nothing but tired decency and the faintest flicker of an old man's hope that maybe kindness could still matter. After a few seconds, she rose. "Thank you," she said softly. Jacob only nodded. She followed him to the back. He handed her a towel, then turned away while she stepped inside the small storage room, turned makeshift guest room. Moments later, the creak of the cot, settling under her weight, reached his ears. He returned to the front, resumed wiping the counters, though they were already clean. His mind spun quietly. Who was she? Why had she been walking alone in a storm like that? Why did she look both terrified and relieved at once? He didn't have answers, but strangely, for the first time in months, the bakery didn't feel so cold, not because of the heater or the food or the oven, because someone was here, someone alive. And Jacob Hart, the lonely baker of Harborview Lane, found himself hoping, for no reason at all, that she would stay just a little longer, just one more day. Jacob drifted between the front counter and the window, each minute stretching out like hours. Outside, the rain had lost none of its fury, hammering the sidewalk with an unbroken rhythm. Thunder cracked in the distance, then rolled like a drumbeat across the sky. The streets remained empty, blurred behind a curtain of water. He stared through the glass, watching droplets race down the pane. Occasionally he'd check the old wall clock above the register. The minute hand barely moved. He didn't know why he was watching time so closely. Maybe because for the first time in ages it felt like something was happening that wasn't routine. From the back room he could hear the faint shifting of the cot springs and the occasional soft exhale. She was sleeping. At least he hoped she was. The weight she carried in her posture was more than physical. Something had broken inside her. He'd seen it in the way she clutched the blanket, how she scanned the room like someone constantly bracing for danger. Jacob returned to the prep table. Even if today wasn't a business day, his hands needed something to do. He rolled out dough for a fresh batch of cinnamon rolls. Her reaction to the first one had lingered with him. It was the closest thing to joy he'd seen on her face. As he kneaded the dough, his thoughts wandered. He couldn't remember the last time someone needed him beyond a transaction. But this was different. This woman hadn't come in for bread or a latte. She'd come in from the storm. She'd chosen his door. Out of every house, every business, every closed cafe along the waterfront, she had picked his. That meant something. Footsteps. Soft, slow, approaching from the back hallway. Jacob looked up as she entered the kitchen doorway, wrapped in the wool blanket like a shawl. Her hair was still damp, tied back loosely, and her eyes looked clearer, though still guarded. "I hope I didn't sleep too long," she murmured, voice hoarse. "Not at all," he said, brushing flour from his hands. "Storm's still going. You've got time." She nodded, eyeing the counter. "You're baking again." He gave a small smile. "Hard to stop. Old habits." She moved toward the stool near the prep table and hesitated. He gestured with a tilt of his head. "You can sit if you're feeling up to it." She slid onto the stool with cautious grace. For a while she said nothing. just watched as he sprinkled cinnamon sugar and began rolling the dough into tight spirals. "You work alone?" she asked. Jacob glanced at her. "Always have." "No family?" He hesitated before answering. "Not anymore." Her expression flickered, something between sympathy and regret. "I'm sorry." He shook his head. "Don't be. Life happens. This place, it's been enough." The woman watched him carefully, then glanced down at the counter, tracing a finger through a dusting of flour. "My name's Amelia," she said finally. Jacob stopped mid-roll. Amelia, it suited her, strong but quiet, elegant even when soaked and shivering. "I'm Jacob," he replied. "Nice to meet you, officially." She nodded. "Thanks for not asking too many questions." "I figured you'd talk when you were ready." Another silence passed, but this one was easier, more settled. "You really made these just now?" she asked, nodding toward the rolls. He smiled again, this time wider. "Yes, ma'am, and you're getting the first one." Amelia chuckled softly, and for a fleeting second, she looked like someone who wasn't running from something, someone who belonged here. Jacob slid the tray into the oven. As the scent of butter, cinnamon, and brown sugar began to fill the room again, the bakery felt full, not with customers but with meaning. The storm raged on outside, but inside 2 people sat across a counter, warmed not by fire but by the quiet comfort of unexpected company. The oven's warmth filled the small bakery like a soft blanket. The scent of rising dough and melting sugar spread slowly, curling through every corner like an old friend returning after a long absence. Amelia sat in silence, her hands now free from the blanket, resting on the edge of the counter. She wasn't cold anymore, not from the rain anyway. Jacob moved quietly, his body in sync with the rhythm of the kitchen. Every gesture was careful, unhurried. He didn't try to fill the air with small talk. He didn't ask more than she was ready to give. He simply was, present, grounded, like the bakery itself. The timer ticked once, then twice. Jacob opened the oven door. A soft golden light spilled out as he carefully removed the tray of cinnamon rolls. Their tops shimmered with caramelized glaze, the aroma now thick and intoxicating. He placed one roll on a plate, still steaming, and slid it across the counter without a word. Amelia stared at it. She looked up at him, then back at the plate. It was a simple gesture. No questions, no expectations, just an offering. She picked up the fork and broke off a piece, the dough so soft it yielded with no resistance. She took a bite, her eyes closed, not just to savor the taste, but to hold on to something real, something that reminded her of warmth, of safety, of the idea that people could still give without wanting something in return. "I haven't had anything this good in a long time," she murmured. Jacob poured 2 mugs of coffee and handed her one. "Secret recipe, came from my grandmother, passed down through mistakes." Amelia smiled behind the rim of her cup. "I'd say the mistakes paid off." They ate slowly, letting the rain serve as the only soundtrack. Occasionally thunder cracked again, but it no longer felt like a threat. It was just weather now, loud, wet, distant. After a few minutes, Jacob moved to a small shelf behind the register and pulled down an old radio. He fiddled with the dial until a low, jazzy instrumental hummed through the speakers. It crackled here and there, as if even the music wasn't quite sure it wanted to be heard. Amelia sipped her coffee and looked around. "This place," she said softly, It's like something from a storybook. Jacob chuckled. That's the idea. Didn't always look like this, though. It took years to give it soul. You did it alone? He nodded. One brick at a time. This shop, it's the only thing I've ever built that didn't fall apart. The weight in his voice surprised her. It wasn't self-pity, it was memory. Lived in truth. Amelia hesitated, then said, Sometimes you have to lose everything before you figure out what really matters. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither of them looked away. She didn't say what she'd lost, and he didn't ask. But something passed between them, wordless and electric. Recognition. Two people quietly carrying more than anyone could see. The bell above the door jingled faintly, pushed by the wind. They both turned their heads, but no one entered. The storm had flared up again outside, rain falling in slanted streaks against the glass. Amelia shivered just once. Jacob stood and gestured gently toward the cot in the back again. Still yours if you need it. Amelia looked at him for a long time, then nodded. I think I'll stay, just until the rain lets up. He smiled. Of course. She disappeared into the back once more, leaving her empty plate and coffee cup behind. Jacob stood in the middle of the shop, staring at them. Then he walked to the window and watched the rain. He didn't know who she really was or where she was headed, but he had offered her shelter, warmth, and a cinnamon roll. And somehow, without saying so, he'd offered something more, a safe place to land. The storm wore itself down by mid-afternoon, the thunder less insistent now, the rain gentler, as if the sky had cried itself out. But inside the bakery, time moves differently. The rhythm of kneading, the scent of sugar and spice, and the quiet presence of Amelia had changed the shop's energy. Jacob cleaned methodically, wiping counters and stacking trays. He didn't need to work today. There were no customers braving the storm, but he found comfort in the motions. The familiarity grounded him, helped him keep from overthinking the surreal turn of events. Behind him, the soft creak of the floorboard signaled Amelia's return. She'd changed into a spare flannel shirt he'd left by the cot and rolled the sleeves to her elbows. It was oversized on her, but she didn't seem to mind. Do you need help with anything? She asked. Jacob looked up, surprised, but not unpleasantly so. You don't have to. I know, she replied, but I'd like to. He hesitated only a moment before nodding toward a mixing bowl. You can start with that. We're making apple crumbles next. She rolled up her sleeves further and stepped behind the counter, her eyes alert, focused. He gave her brief instructions and watched as she moved through the steps with careful hands. She wasn't experienced, but she was thoughtful, measured, and more than that, she was present, as if for the first time in a long while, she felt safe enough to exist in the moment. As they worked, the silence between them evolved from tentative to companionable. Jacob found himself speaking more than usual, not about her, but about him. Stories about the early days of the bakery, about a regular customer who used to bring his dog inside, about how his father never approved of baking and wanted him to become a carpenter instead. Amelia listened closely, her expression unreadable at times, but always intent. You loved someone, didn't you? She asked quietly during a lull. Jacob's hands paused over the tray of sliced apples. Yes, he said finally, a long time ago. She died. Cancer. I'm sorry." He shrugged softly, not out of indifference, but acceptance. "It's life. You hold on to the good parts, let the rest melt like butter." She smiled faintly. "That's a baker's way of saying it." They both chuckled, and for a moment the storm outside was just a memory. There was laughter in the bakery again, light, fleeting, but real. Evening settled over the town, casting the streets in amber and violet hues. The last of the storm clouds drifted toward the sea, leaving behind puddles and silence. The windows of the bakery glowed warmly, drawing curious glances from a few brave passers-by, though none came in. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of baked apples and spice. The crumbles were cooling on the racks, and Amelia sat by the oven once more, cradling a fresh mug of tea. Jacob sat opposite her, drying his hands on a towel, his apron dusted with flour like snow. "Have you ever thought about leaving this place?" she asked, staring into her cup. Jacob considered the question. "I did. Once or twice, but this place, it's home. Not because it's perfect, but because it's mine." Amelia nodded, her eyes distant. He didn't press, but after a long pause she spoke again. "I used to think I had everything figured out. A career, money, respect. But I woke up one day and realized I didn't know what it meant to just be." She looked up at him. "And then I walked into your bakery, and you didn't ask me who I was or what I'd done. You just handed me a cinnamon roll." Jacob gave a half smile. Sometimes that's all a person needs. The lights flickered slightly, an after effect of the storm, but neither moved. They sat in that moment, lit by oven fire and soft lamps, their shadows long on the walls. Outside, the town resumed its quiet life. Inside, two strangers baked their way back toward something they'd both forgotten how to find: human connection. The next morning arrived gently, with sunlight piercing through the remaining clouds, casting golden shafts across the bakery floor. The storm was finally over, but the stillness in the air felt like a held breath. Jacob had already been up for an hour, prepping the morning batch: sourdough, brioche, and a few trays of his regular cinnamon twists. For once, the motions didn't feel like routine. They felt necessary, purposeful, like he was preparing not just food, but a welcome. Amelia emerged from the back room just as he slid the first tray into the oven. Her hair was combed, her clothes dry and neater now, though still borrowed. She walked with less weight in her steps, like sleep had chipped away at whatever had been pressing down on her. "Smells incredible," she said with a sleepy smile. Jacob turned to see something new on her face. Not the cautious politeness of a stranger, not the guarded mask of someone surviving. It was real, a smile, and not just with her mouth, but with her eyes. Warm, alive, grateful. "Coffee?" he asked. She nodded. "Please." As they sat at the small table by the window, Jacob handed her a cup. The sunlight made the table gleam, and for the first time in a long while, it looked like a cafe again, not a memory. Amelia leaned back in her chair, sipping the coffee slowly. "I forgot how peaceful mornings could be," she said. Jacob looked out the window. Most people do. Rushing to be somewhere. Chasing something. She turned to him. "And you? You don't chase?" He shook his head. "Not anymore. I let what matters come through the door." Her smile deepened. "That's how I got in, huh?" Jacob chuckled. "You were a little louder than most." They both laughed, And it wasn't awkward. It was easy. The kind of laugh people share when there's nothing left to hide in that moment. He watched her as she gazed out the window. She wasn't just resting, she was healing in quiet, unspoken ways. Maybe he was too. By noon, the shop had drawn its first real customers of the day, two elderly women seeking coffee and rolls, followed by a young man from the marina looking for his usual scone. No one asked about Amelia. She blended in, floating quietly behind the counter, occasionally helping with dishes or passing trays to the front. It was an unspoken agreement. Jacob didn't introduce her, and she didn't offer more than a polite nod or smile. But her presence made the shop feel lighter. As the sun lowered and golden hour painted the bakery in honeyed tones, Jacob wiped the final counter and glanced at the clock. Nearly closing time. "You don't have to keep helping," he said gently. "You've done more than enough." Amelia stood at the sink, hands still soapy. "I don't mind. Keeps my hands busy. Keeps my mind from wandering too far." He understood that more than he cared to admit. When the last plate was dried and the chairs were stacked, Jacob turned off the open sign and drew the blinds. The quiet returned, but not the same lonely quiet of before. This one was shared. Amelia stood by the front door for a moment, eyes scanning the darkened street. "I should probably go," she said quietly. Jacob's heart dipped. "You don't have to." "Not yet." She hesitated, then looked back at him. "Just one more night?" He nodded. "Of course." No questions, no expectations, just shelter, just kindness. She turned away from the door, walked slowly back to the cot. Jacob listened to her footsteps fade into the back room. And for the second night in a row, the bakery, once silent and still, held life again. A stranger, a smile, and the echo of something that might be hope. Morning light spilled across the bakery in slanted beams, golden and warm, the kind of sunrise Jacob hadn't noticed in a long time. He stood behind the counter sipping his coffee, half smiling at the thought that the place finally smelled like a home again, not just a shop. He glanced toward the back room, quiet, too quiet. Setting his mug down, he walked slowly to the door and knocked gently, then pushed it open. The cot was empty, neatly made, the wool blanket folded at the edge. The flannel shirt, his shirt, was draped over the chair. On the cot sat a single piece of paper folded in half. Jacob stared at it for a long moment before picking it up. In delicate handwriting, that was it. No full name. No goodbye. No hint of where she was going. She had vanished as quietly as she had arrived. Jacob leaned against the door frame, the note still in his hand. He should have expected this. She was always passing through. She had said so herself. But still, her absence hit harder than he imagined. The bakery felt larger somehow, emptier, too much space where warmth had briefly been. He folded the note carefully and slipped it into his pocket. Then he turned on the ovens. Even if she was gone, the day still needed to begin, and something inside him whispered, maybe this wasn't the end. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of kneading and baking, customers and casual greetings. Jacob smiled where he needed to, asked about the weather, nodded at stories he barely heard, but his mind kept drifting back to the empty cot, to the note, to Amelia. Her presence still clung to the space, like cinnamon in the air. like the echo of footsteps on old wooden floors. He found himself watching the door more often than usual, listening for the sound of the bell. Each time it jingled, a tiny jolt of hope sparked inside him, but it was never her. By noon, he'd tucked the note behind a tin of old recipes in the back office. Not hidden, just kept safe. That afternoon, while rearranging a shelf of cookbooks, he found the mug she'd used, still in the drying rack, the lip of it stained faintly by her tea. He dried it slowly, turning it over in his hands like a memory he wasn't ready to let go of. He placed it back on the shelf. Near the end of the day, a local customer, a regular, pointed at the cinnamon rolls on display and said, "They're softer today, sweeter too." Jacob blinked. "I suppose they are," he replied. That night when he locked up, he paused at the door a little longer than usual, gazing down the street. The wind had picked up again, ruffling the awning. The town was settling into its quiet night rhythm, but Jacob stood there, waiting. For what, he didn't know. Maybe for her to return, maybe just for something to change. He turned off the sign and went back inside. But as the door clicked shut behind him, he didn't feel alone. Not entirely, because sometimes even when a person vanishes, they leave crumbs behind. Little pieces of warmth, kindness, and memory, just enough to carry you to the next sunrise. Days passed, and the storm became a memory. The streets of the quiet coastal town slowly returned to normal. Fishermen hauled in their nets with practiced hands. Shopkeepers opened on schedule. Children raced along puddle-dotted sidewalks, their laughter echoing through the narrow lanes. But Jacob felt the shift like a pebble in his shoe. Small, persistent, impossible to ignore. Amelia's departure had left more than just an empty cot and a folded blanket. It had left a vacancy in the rhythm of his days. He found himself preparing extra coffee without thinking, placing 2 cups instead of 1 on the counter. Sometimes when slicing loaves or glazing pastries, he'd look up, expecting to see her there, ready to ask if she could help. She never was. Still, something in him resisted the finality of it. Then the whispers started. A pair of old men at a corner table mentioned they'd seen someone, a woman soaked and walking alone, near the cliffside the morning after the storm. She looked out of place, didn't speak, disappeared before anyone could ask more. Jacob, drying mugs behind the counter, froze when he heard that. It had to be her, but where had she gone? Why? And why was her silence echoing louder now than when she was standing right beside him? He didn't ask questions, not to them, not to anyone. Instead, he filed the whispers away like he did her note, carefully folded, quietly held. With Amelia gone, Jacob fell back into his old routine, but it didn't fit the way it used to. He still opened the shop before dawn, still prepped his sourdough and cinnamon twists, still arranged his display with care. But everything was quieter, not the peaceful kind of quiet, the kind that feels too big, the kind that makes you notice the click of every clock hand, the creak of every board, the absence of footsteps that used to mean something. He'd reach for a bowl and remember how she'd handed it to him. He'd wipe a counter and think of her tracing her finger through flour, her brow furrowed in playful concentration. Customers noticed something too. "You all right, Jacob?" one asked, biting into a butter croissant. "Of course," he replied with a practiced smile. "Just tired of rain." But it wasn't raining, it was the space she left behind. That night, after closing, he pulled out her note again, He read it twice, then 3 times. There was no way to reach her. No return address, no phone number, just that small, elegant A. Jacob turned the note over as if the answers might be hidden on the back. Nothing. He sighed and leaned back in his chair, the old wood groaning beneath him. She was just passing through, he whispered to the empty room. But the truth, etched in the silence, was this: he wasn't ready for her to be gone. Jacob kept the note close. He hadn't meant to at first. It had simply stayed in his apron pocket, and then later migrated to the drawer beneath the register, nestled between rubber bands and old receipts. But by the end of the week, he found himself unfolding it every night before bed like a ritual. Thank you for the warmth. I needed to remember what kindness feels like. A. The words had no embellishment, no flourish, just the truth. There was something about the way she wrote warmth that stuck with him. She hadn't said shelter or help. It was warm, something deeper than a dry cot and a hot meal. She had felt something here, something that made her return to that word. And now Jacob read the note like it was a map, not to a location but to a feeling, something rare, unmeasured, and just out of reach. That evening, after the last customer left and the silence returned, Jacob sat by the front window with a cup of tea and the note spread out in front of him. He looked out at the fading sky, the clouds painted orange and lavender. "I hope you're all right," he murmured. And in that moment, more than anything, he hoped she remembered him too. The following morning, a flurry of excitement stirred the town. The regulars were abuzz, chattering in hushed tones as they sipped their coffee and tore into warm rolls. "Did you hear about the woman at the docks?" "No, what happened?" "She hired the entire marina to clear out the landing pad." "A landing pad?" "Yeah, said she was expecting something big." Jacob leaned in just slightly, pouring coffee into a mug, ears sharp. "She looked expensive," someone said. "Suit, heels, whole team is with her." Jacob felt a shift in the air, like a low tide drawing back before a wave. "She had this way about her," the man continued. "Didn't smile, but you could feel the power, like she didn't belong in a town like this." Jacob's heart tapped against his ribs. Could it be? Number it couldn't. He returned behind the counter, wiping down a perfectly clean tray, just to move his hands, but his thoughts spun. Suit, heels, whole team. Nothing like the rain-soaked woman who had appeared in his doorway. And yet, he knew, in his gut, he knew, somehow Amelia hadn't just disappeared. She was back. And this time, she wasn't walking. She was arriving like a thunderclap. The wind shifted suddenly, and with it came a low, distant hum, steady, mechanical, unnatural. Jacob stood at the front of the bakery, coffee mug forgotten in his hand, staring out through the large bay window as the sound grew louder, closer. Then the sound changed, deeper now, heavier, and the glass began to tremble slightly in its frame. Customers paused mid-conversation. "What in the world is that?" someone murmured. Jacob knew. Somehow, even before the shadows moved across the rooftops and the wind from the rotor blades swept fallen leaves into the air, he knew. A helicopter right above the town. The last time anyone had seen a chopper near this sleepy coast had been a rescue mission years ago. This wasn't that. This was something else, smoother, sleeker, controlled. The entire town slowed to a standstill, as the aircraft circled low, heading toward the marina at the edge of the inlet. Jacob moved outside, squinting into the wind. His apron whipped against his legs, and he raised a hand to shield his eyes. Down the street, near the docks, he saw the commotion. A small team of sharply dressed people were already on the ground, radioing directions, clearing a perimeter, and in the middle of it, just beyond the orange windsocks and tarps. She stepped out. Amelia, hair tied back, black blazer, slim briefcase in one hand, phone in the other. She was flanked by two assistants, but walked like she needed no one. Her presence sliced through the noise, and the murmuring crowd parted before her as if the wind itself obeyed her pace. Jacob stared. She was the same woman who had stood in his bakery, in soaked clothes and wrapped in a wool blanket. But she was also entirely different. The softness he remembered was still there, buried beneath tailored lines and steel posture. But now she was no mystery. She was someone who commanded attention, someone who didn't walk into a bakery unnoticed, someone the world probably already knew by name. And yet, when she turned toward the street and saw him, her entire face softened. She didn't smile with the cool formality of a public figure. She smiled like someone coming home. She raised one hand, small but steady, and Jacob, stunned, simply nodded. The helicopter's blades began to slow behind her, the whir gradually fading as she walked, purposefully, directly toward the bakery, toward him. Toward the place she had once entered as a stranger in the storm, and now returned, with skies cleared and secrets ready to unfold. Jacob stepped back as Amelia approached the bakery, her footsteps precise on the cobbled street, but her expression was anything but cold. She reached the front of the shop, the door swinging open with a soft chime that somehow sounded louder than usual. Every eye inside the bakery turned toward her, but she saw only him. "Morning," she said, voice calm but warm. Jacob blinked. "You came back." "I said I was just passing through," she replied, lips twitching into a smile. "I never said I wouldn't pass through again." He exhaled through a laugh, still stunned. "Well, you certainly made an entrance this time." A few customers chuckled nervously from their seats, unsure whether to stay or leave. The air was thick with curiosity. Who was this woman who had arrived like a storm cloud in heels? Amelia glanced around the room, eyes brushing over each face like a quiet inventory. Then she stepped up to the counter. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to the stool on the customer side. "Of course," Jacob said, still trying to adjust to the surreal presence of her again, polished, powerful, and yet somehow more familiar than ever. She sat and removed her blazer, draping it neatly over her lap. "I wanted to see the place again while it was still yours." Jacob's brow furrowed. "Still mine? What do you mean?" She met his gaze, steady and clear. "I have something to tell you, and I think you deserve to hear it before the rest of the world does." He leaned forward, hands on the counter. "Go on." Amelia took a slow breath, as if bracing herself. "My name is Amelia Rhodes, Chief Executive Officer of Rhodes and King's Investment Group. Maybe you've heard of it. Maybe you haven't." Jacob's mouth parted slightly. He had heard of it, in the background noise of the news, in headlines he skimmed and forgot. A corporate powerhouse, private equity, global reach, far, far from the world of flour and cinnamon. I left it all, she continued, at least temporarily. No press, no entourage, just disappeared for a while. I needed to know something. Jacob said nothing. He waited. I wanted to know, she said softly, if people could still be kind without knowing who you are. If warmth was something you could find without a bank account behind it. Her eyes locked on his. You proved that it is. Jacob felt the weight of her words sink into him slowly, like dough rising in the dark. The woman in the storm, the woman who folded napkins and scrubbed trays. She had been testing something far deeper than survival. She had been looking for proof of humanity, and somehow he had been the answer. You could have stayed, he said after a long silence. I couldn't, she replied gently. Not then. I wasn't ready. I needed to go back, to close the doors I'd left open. Jacob nodded slowly. And now? Amelia gave him the kind of smile that held both apology and gratitude. Now I came to say thank you, and to ask if you'd let me return, not just for coffee or shelter, but with a proposal. Jacob raised an eyebrow. A proposal? Her gaze didn't flinch. Let me help you. Let me invest in this place, not to change it, but to keep it alive, to share it with more people who need what I found here. This bakery changed something in me, Jacob. I want to help others do the same. For the first time in many years, Jacob felt his foundation shift, not with fear, but with possibility. The woman who had once needed a place to land was now offering him wings. The bell over the door rang again as a gust of wind swept in. But Jacob and Amelia didn't look away from each other. The sounds of the bakery faded, chairs scooting, cups clinking, the low murmur of curious patrons, until all that remained between them was stillness. Jacob studied her face, now stripped of disguise, but not of sincerity. You're really her? He asked, voice low, as if saying it aloud would shatter the illusion. Amelia gave a small, slow nod. Amelia Rhodes. Yes, though I haven't felt like her in a while. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a glossy black business card. Clean, minimalist. Her name is embossed in silver. She slid it across the counter to him. He didn't take it. I don't need proof, he said simply. I saw you when you had no card, no title, no helicopter. That stopped her. Amelia looked at him with something between admiration and grief. And that's why I came back, because you saw me, not the version that everyone wants something from. Jacob finally leaned back, hands folded on the counter. You didn't owe me anything. I know, she said. That's what makes you rare. Outside, a few pedestrians had gathered near the marina, still gawking at the helicopter. But inside the bakery, something more profound was unfolding, something no headline would capture. I didn't come to repay a debt, Amelia continued. I came to honor a promise I made to myself, that if someone ever reminded me what being human felt like again, I'd do something good with the second chance. Jacob said nothing for a long moment. Then, quietly, you came in the rain with nothing. You're offering to leave sunshine and money behind. That's a rare thing, too. Their eyes met again, older souls recognizing each other, finally standing still long enough to be seen. They sat in the quiet bakery after closing hours. The chairs had been flipped upside down, the floors swept, and the sign on the door now read, "Closed," but the lights remained on, casting a warm glow on flour-streaked surfaces and half-finished pastries. Jacob poured 2 cups of tea and handed one to Amelia. She curled her hands around the mug like she had that first night, except this time there was no trembling, just memory. "I should tell you something," she said. Jacob raised an eyebrow. "More surprises?" Amelia nodded slowly. That night, it wasn't a coincidence. He tensed slightly, listening. I'd been walking for hours, not physically, but in my life, just walking away from everything, from the weight of who I'd become. The storm made me stop, but I chose where I stopped. She looked around the bakery. This place had light, real light, not just electric, warmth in the windows. I remember thinking, if there's any humanity left in the world, it'll be behind that door. Jacob's throat tightened, but he said nothing. I told myself if you turned me away, I'd leave the world I knew behind for good, burn every bridge. But you didn't. You gave me soup, bread, and silence, and that silence saved me. Jacob looked down at his cup, processing. So it was a test, he said. Of me? No, she said quickly. Of hope, and you passed. He let out a slow breath. I wasn't trying to prove anything, he said quietly. I know, Amelia replied. That's why it mattered. The two of them sat in silence again, this time not from discomfort, but from the weight of everything that had finally been said. Then Amelia reached into her handbag once more and pulled out a simple folder. I drew up something, just a draft. You don't have to say yes, but I meant what I said. I want to invest, quietly, no press, no nameplates, just enough to make this place easier on you, on others. Jacob opened it slowly. The offer was generous, beyond generous, and yet respectful, thoughtful, like someone who knew what it meant to give without taking. He looked up at her. Let's talk more tomorrow, he said. Amelia smiled. Of course. And for the first time, she looked like both the woman in the rain and the one who stepped off the helicopter. Whole, real, finally seen. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the first true spring morning in weeks. Golden sunlight spilled through the bakery windows, casting warm shadows on flour-dusted surfaces. Jacob stood behind the counter in his usual cardigan and apron, but something in his stance was different, lighter, like a man no longer carrying his world alone. Amelia returned just after 8, dressed in jeans and a wool sweater, her hair pulled back into a low ponytail. She looked less like a billionaire this time, and more like the woman who had once wiped dishes in silence after a stormy night. Jacob poured 2 coffees without asking. They sat across from each other at the table by the front window. The draft contract rested between them, its edges smoothed from where Jacob had unfolded and refolded it a dozen times. I read it again this morning, he said, 3 times actually. And it's fair, too fair, honestly. Amelia tilted her head. You think I should have offered less? I think, Jacob said carefully, that people like me don't usually get offers like this, not without losing something. Amelia leaned forward. You won't lose anything. That's the point. No rebranding, no staff invasion, no sudden artisan gourmet transformation. This place stays what it is. You keep ownership. I just help keep the lights on and the ovens hot. Jacob stared at her. Why me? Amelia smiled gently. Because you're not trying to be anything other than who you are. And places like this, people like you, they're rare. They're what the world's forgetting. The silence that followed was heavy, but comforting. I don't want a franchise, Jacob finally said. I don't want to be some Instagram stop. You won't be, she promised. This isn't about going viral. This is about staying alive. Jacob looked at the folder again, and then, finally, he nodded. All right, he said, let's do it. Amelia's face broke into a smile, not triumphant but relieved, like something inside her had just landed. You won't regret it, she said. I know, Jacob replied. You're not just passing through this time. She shook her head. Not anymore. By the end of the week, the first signs of change began to ripple through the bakery, gently, respectfully. The ancient espresso machine was replaced with a modern twin-boiler model, identical in design but more efficient. The wooden sign above the door got a quiet repaint, restoring the faded heart and hearth without altering its charm. Local curiosity was inevitable. People asked questions. Did you finally win the lottery, Jacob? Got a silent partner now? Is that the lady from the helicopter? Jacob deflected as best he could. Just some long overdue upgrades, he said. Had a little help from a friend. Still, the attention made him uneasy. Late one night, after cleaning up, Jacob sat alone in the darkened shop. A single bulb glowed over the register. The folder with Amelia's proposal lay beside a fresh cup of chamomile tea. He should have felt proud, excited. He was finally getting a chance to revive his life's work. But doubt had crept in like flour dust, light, invisible, choking. What if the bakery became something he no longer recognized? What if he lost the soul of the place trying to save it? What if this was a second chance disguised as a slow goodbye? He rubbed his face and sighed, eyes on the closed door. Then, as if on cue, Amelia texted, "You okay?" He stared at the message for a long second, then typed back, "Still baking, still breathing, just thinking. Don't think too hard. I trust you. You're the soul of this place. I'm just the breeze." Jacob smiled faintly at that. She had brought the storm. But maybe, just maybe, she was also the wind that could lift him without blowing him away. The bakery was changing, not in ways that screamed for attention, but in subtle, thoughtful details that only regulars would notice. The creaky floorboard near the front counter, reinforced and sanded. The antique ceiling fan that had rattled in summer, replaced with a quiet, vintage-inspired fixture. The chalkboard menu? Still handwritten, but now with clearer lines and a new frame Amelia had chosen herself. Hand-carved oak, just like the window trim. Jacob had been hesitant at first, but Amelia's approach had been careful, reverent. She never made a single change without asking. Every suggestion came with a question, not a command, and she always asked why something mattered before deciding how to help it last. The biggest change was in the back room. What had once been a forgotten storage space with an old cot and dusty shelves was now a cozy break room, fresh paint, a small table and chairs, a bookshelf filled with cookbooks and short stories. A kettle is always ready. "It's not just for me," she said one day, smiling at Jacob as he inspected the new light fixture. "It's for anyone who might need a warm place again." Jacob didn't say anything. He just nodded, because somehow she had understood that this bakery had always been more than a shop. It had always been a refuge. Now it looked like one. It started with a tweet, A food blogger passing through town had ordered a cinnamon roll and posted a photo with the caption, "Found the best cinnamon roll of my life in a tiny coastal town. The baker doesn't even have a website, just a smile and soul." The post went viral overnight. Then came the Instagram influencers, then the travel vloggers. Soon, cars Jacob didn't recognize were pulling into town just to find the bakery with the billionaire backer. Someone had leaked Amelia's involvement, and though she denied comment, the rumors fed themselves. Jacob's once quiet mornings were suddenly lined with customers outside the door, phones in hand, snapping photos of their lattes, their pastries, and even him. At first he handled it with grace. A polite smile, an extra batch of rolls, a new part-timer to help handle the rush. But the noise grew. People wanted selfies. Some tried to ask about Amelia. Others offered to franchise his brand. And one afternoon, a customer tried to rename a menu item, the Rhodes Roll. That was when Jacob snapped. He calmly handed the man his change and walked into the back room. He didn't yell, he didn't cry, but he stood there, hands clenched at his sides, breathing through the rising tide of discomfort. Amelia found him there minutes later. "You okay?" she asked gently. He didn't turn around. "This isn't what I wanted." Her voice was soft, careful. "I know. Neither did I." Jacob finally turned. "I wanted to keep the soul, Amelia. Please do not sell it." "You haven't," she said. "Not yet, but I hear you. We need to set boundaries. Remind people what this place is for, not followers, not fame, community." He studied her face. She wasn't just offering help now. She was protecting what they'd built. Jacob nodded slowly. "Then let's make sure we don't forget how this all started." Amelia smiled. A stranger, a storm, and a cinnamon roll. The bakery had never been busier. Customers flowed in and out like tides, eager for the now famous cinnamon rolls and a glimpse of the humble man behind them. But beneath the buzz, the warmth that once radiated from heart and hearth began to cool, just slightly, just enough to notice. Jacob tried to hold on to the old rhythm. He still arrived before sunrise, still tied on his apron the same way, still prepared the dough with the same deliberate care. But it is harder now. The counter was constantly lined with new faces, few of whom understood the silence he once treasured. The requests were louder, the expectations are higher. The conversations are more about cameras than kindness. "Do you have oat milk? Can you make gluten-free sourdough? Can I get 6 rolls to go, but prettier? For the gram?" He smiled. He obliged. He adapted. But inside, something buckled a little more each day. The regulars, his old friends, had stopped lingering. They didn't like having to fight for a table. They missed the quiet. The corner seat by the window now belonged to someone FaceTiming with a ring light. One afternoon, Jacob watched a teenager take a bite of a cinnamon roll, then immediately turn to a friend and say, "Mid, kinda overrated." He said nothing. But that night, when he went to prepare the dough for the morning batch, he found his hands wouldn't move. He stood over the mixing bowl for 10 full minutes before quietly putting everything away and turning off the lights. The soul of his bakery hadn't been sold, but it was slipping from his hands. The tension finally broke on a Thursday. A large party had shown up unannounced. Some food tour group with matching T-shirts and camera equipment. They ordered enough pastries to wipe out the display, rearranged tables without asking, and loudly recounted stories from places they'd conquered on their cafe map. Jacob tried to stay calm. He tried to remind himself that it was good for business, that this was what growth looked like. But when one of them knocked over a ceramic bread display, his mother's gifted to him when the bakery first opened, he froze. The piece shattered into dozens of pieces. No one apologized. They just laughed it off and kept filming. Jacob picked up the shards in silence, cradling them in his hands like bone fragments. His chest was tight, his jaw clenched. Amelia entered from the back at just the wrong moment. She had just come from a call, still holding her phone. She stopped cold at the sight of him. He didn't yell, but the words came out sharp, tired, raw. "This isn't what I built, Amelia." She stepped closer. "Jacob, I didn't know." "You said you'd protect it," he said louder now. "But it's gone. It's not mine anymore. It's a photo booth with coffee." Amelia froze. The bakery was suddenly quiet. She could have defended herself, explained, argued, but instead she looked at the broken ceramic in his hands and whispered, "I'm sorry." And then she turned, walked out the front door and disappeared into the afternoon sunlight. Jacob stood alone behind the counter, the pieces still in his hands. The bakery wasn't empty, but for the first time in a long while, he was. It was 2 days before Amelia returned. The bakery had quieted again, not because the crowds had vanished, but because Jacob had closed the doors. A simple handwritten sign hung in the window, closed for repairs, no date, no explanation. Inside, he worked in silence. He scrubbed floors that didn't need scrubbing, polished windows no one had dirtied, reorganized jars, sifted flour, refolded towels, anything to keep his hands busy and his mind from spiraling. But the ache wouldn't go away. He missed her, not the investor, not the woman from the headlines. Her. So when the bell above the door finally jingled again, his heart jumped, and his instinct was to brace for confrontation. But when Amelia stepped inside, there was no suit, no heels, no entourage. She wore jeans and a faded coat, her face bare, her eyes tired. She looked like the woman from that first storm again, the one who'd arrived dripping, silent, and lost. Jacob said nothing. She held up a brown paper bag and stepped forward slowly. "I brought you something," she said quietly. He hesitated, then took it. Inside was a cinnamon roll, slightly misshapen, clearly homemade. "I tried your recipe," she said, a faint, rueful smile on her lips. "Turns out it's harder than you make it look." Jacob looked at the roll, then at her. "It's good," he said. "You didn't taste it." "I don't have to." She exhaled, a shaky breath. "I didn't mean for things to get so noisy." "I know," he said. Amelia took a slow step forward. "I came here that night because I had lost everything. Not the money, not the power. I lost myself." She looked down. "I built my life out of ambition, and I climbed so high I couldn't breathe. And then I walked into your bakery, and for the first time in years, someone looked at me and didn't see what I could offer. They just handed me a cinnamon roll." Jacob finally spoke, his voice softer now. "You needed something quiet. So did I." She nodded, her voice cracking. "I ruined it, didn't I?" "No," he said gently, "but we forgot what made it special." The silence between them wasn't heavy now. It was healing. Amelia stepped closer. "I still want to help," she said, but only if we rebuild it the way it began. Quiet, kind, whole. Jacob looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled out a chair and nodded toward it. "Then sit down," he said. "We've got work to do." They sat for hours that night, long after the sun dipped below the horizon and the streetlights buzzed to life. The bakery was closed, but inside it felt more alive than it had in weeks. The lights were dim, the counters clean, the air still thick with the scent of flour and brown sugar. Jacob spoke of his wife, how she used to sit at the corner table and write in a leather journal while he baked. How cancer had taken her so quickly that he never had time to prepare. How the bakery became his lifeline in the silence that followed. "I used to make cinnamon rolls just for her," he said. "She liked them undercooked in the middle, called them guilty pillows." He smiled faintly. "I still undercook one batch every week just in case." Amelia wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. "I know what it means to lose someone," she whispered. "Not to death, to life. People I thought would always be there just faded. Some left, some changed. Some never saw me again once I stopped being useful." She wrapped her arms around herself. "That night I came here, I didn't think I'd find warmth. I just wanted to stop walking." Jacob looked at her. "I think we saved each other that night," he said. She nodded. "Then let's not forget it." They sat in silence after that, not the kind that fills space awkwardly, but the kind that only exists between two people who understand one another. Outside, a gentle drizzle began to fall again, tapping softly on the windows. But this time, no one felt lost in it. They were exactly where they were supposed to be. The days that followed were quieter, but not in the way that marked decline. This was a calm, intentional quiet, the kind that invited reflection, the kind that let warmth settle in. Amelia stayed. Not every hour, not always at the front, but she was there, in the back room reading recipes, on the weekends helping roll dough, on Wednesdays managing orders and slipping notes of encouragement into the register drawer where Jacob would find them late at night. They began rebuilding together. Jacob, more relaxed than before, let himself enjoy the small moments. Amelia humming a melody while wiping down tables, the smell of her tea steeping next to his coffee, the occasional soft touch of her hand resting beside his on the counter. There was nothing rushed, nothing forced. One evening, long after the bakery had closed and the oven's warmth had faded to embers, they sat side by side at the window table, 2 slices of apple crumble between them, the kind they had once baked on a stormy day. "I like the quiet now," Amelia said, breaking a piece with her fork. Jacob smiled, eyes fixed on the rain beginning to dust the pavement. "Me too. Not because it's empty, but because it's full in a different way." She nodded. "I used to fill silence with noise. Now I think I'm learning to listen." Jacob looked over at her. "You're not just passing through anymore, are you?" Amelia shook her head, eyes soft. "I think I've arrived." It started with a shift in the air, humid, heavy, electric, the kind of air that makes birds go quiet and children instinctively hurry home. By mid-afternoon, the sky had darkened. A strong wind had picked up, bending trees and sending stray napkins tumbling across the street. Rain began to fall, slow at first, then suddenly hard and fast, slapping against the bakery windows like fingers tapping to be let in. Jacob looked up from the oven just as the bell above the door jingled. There, drenched and shivering, stood a young woman, maybe 20, maybe younger, wearing a soaked jacket and thin sneakers, arms wrapped around her body. Her hair stuck to her face in matted clumps, and her eyes flicked around the shop, wide and wary. She looked just like Amelia had. Jacob didn't hesitate. He stepped out from behind the counter and grabbed a fresh towel from the rack. Amelia, emerging from the back with a tray of muffins, stopped in her tracks and stared, not at the girl but at Jacob's face, because she recognized it, the instinct to give, without reason, without expectation. "Here," Jacob said, offering the towel. "Come warm up." The girl hesitated, stunned by the gesture. "No questions," Jacob added gently. "Just kindness." Amelia placed the muffins down, watching the scene unfold with tears in her eyes. And in that moment something unspoken passed between them. This was the legacy. This was what they had built. Not just a bakery, but a refuge. The girl stepped inside fully. The door closed behind her, muting the storm. Jacob led her to the table near the oven. Amelia poured a cup of tea. The girl looked between them, uncertain. And then, finally, she smiled. A fragile thing, like a matchstick catching flame, but it was enough. The storm outside howled, but inside heart and hearth, kindness was rising again, soft, strong, and warm. The rain poured through the night, but no one inside the bakery seemed to notice any more. The young woman, her name was Mara, sat at the corner table wrapped in the same wool blanket that once covered Amelia. She sipped tea with shaking hands and listened to Jacob's stories, his voice a calming rhythm beneath the storm's song. Amelia sat nearby, gently drying Mara's shoes by the heater. The roles had reversed completely, the once weary traveler now offering comfort to someone who looked exactly like she had months ago. Lost, soaked, and on the edge of giving up. There was no dramatic reveal, no probing questions about where Mara had come from or why she had ended up at their door. It didn't matter. All that mattered was that she had, and now she was safe. "You remind me of someone," Jacob said softly, placing a small plate in front of her. "Warm bread with honey butter." Mara smiled, eyes glassy. "Thank you? I didn't think anyone would stop for me." "That's the funny thing," Amelia said, settling beside her. "Neither did I." The three sat together, the glow of the ovens casting long shadows against the bakery's warm walls. In that silence, something bigger than them began to take root, an unbroken thread of generosity, passed from one to another like yeast folded into dough, rising quietly in the dark. Jacob stood behind the counter the next morning, staring at the weathered note he'd kept hidden for months, the one Amelia had left after that first night. "Thank you for the warmth. I needed to remember what kindness feels like. A." He read it again, then slowly walked to the small corkboard near the front window. With careful hands, he pinned it there, visible now, no longer tucked away. And beneath it, he placed a new note, freshly written in his slanted hand. "To anyone who walks in, lost, wet, or weary, this place is yours too. We don't ask questions. We offer warmth. We offer cinnamon rolls. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you'll find what you didn't know you needed." J. Amelia stood behind him, quiet. She read the note without speaking, then reached into her bag and added something else. A folded photograph of the bakery's window, glowing during a stormy night, a silhouette barely visible inside. Below it, she scribbled, Some of the best moments in life begin with rain. They stood back and looked at the board. 2 notes, 1 photo, a memory made permanent. Later that morning, Mara helped sweep the floors. A new customer lingered with their coffee longer than necessary. A child pointed to the muffins and smiled. Jacob exhaled deeply, peacefully. He wasn't alone. The bakery wasn't a business anymore. It was a beacon. And the message was clear. Kindness lives here. Spring rolled into early summer, and with it came a breeze of promise. Business at Heart and Hearth was steady again, not because of virality, but because the right people kept coming back. People who craved stillness, warmth, connection. Jacob kept the doors open, but the soul of the place had become more protected than ever. One morning, Amelia asked Jacob to take a walk with her, up the hill overlooking the harbor. He followed her with mild curiosity, noticing she held a rolled-up blueprint under her arm. They arrived at the top of a low building, an old, unused rooftop cafe that had been shuttered for years. Cracked tiles, rusted railings, a few stubborn weeds in corners. But the view, it was breathtaking. The town, the sea, the sunrise over the hills. "This," Amelia said, laying out the plans on a makeshift table, "is what I want to do next." Jacob leaned over the paper. A rooftop bakery cafe, open-air seating, planters of rosemary and mint, a skylight bakery kitchen in one corner, quiet music, soft lighting, a place to gather above the noise. "I've already secured the lease," she said, "but I won't do it unless you're part of it." Jacob looked at her, startled. "Me? It's your recipes, your heart. I just want to build something that lets more people experience what I did that night." He stepped back, letting the idea breathe. It was wild, beautiful, terrifying. "Why here?" he asked. She smiled. "Because it's still this town, and because people should feel like they're rising when they heal." He looked out at the horizon, and slowly nodded. The grand opening came 6 weeks later. It wasn't loud. There were no media crews, no press releases, just a handwritten sign placed at the original bakery's window. "Upstairs, the bread still rises. Come see." The Sky Cafe opened under a soft pink sky. Rows of tables stretched along the rooftop, each one with a candle and a small jar of wildflowers. The air smelled like lavender and fresh focaccia. Music played gently in the background, an old jazz record, the kind Jacob used to hum along to when he thought no one was listening. Mara was behind the espresso counter, her once wet sneakers replaced with confident steps and a branded apron. She moved with ease, smiling now without hesitation. Amelia floated between tables, welcoming guests with grace, but not grandeur. There was no mention of her title, no whisper of her wealth, just warmth. And Jacob. He stood in the open-air kitchen, rolling dough, laughing with customers, offering slices of brioche and stories of old days. People didn't rush here. They stayed. They lingered. They watched the sun set and the bakery lights glow. At one point, he stepped back, wiping flour from his hands, and looked across the rooftop. There she was, Amelia, standing at the far railing, watching the sea, her eyes peaceful. She turned and met his gaze. And for the first time, he realized she hadn't just returned. She had built a place for them all to rise. The success of the Sky Cafe didn't take anything away from Heart and Hearth. If anything, it deepened its meaning. Jacob still returned every morning to the little corner bakery before heading up the hill. He'd unlock the old wooden door, turn on the lights, and breathe in the familiar scent of aged wood and memory. The ovens here still spoke to him in a different language, quiet, personal, full of ghosts, that now made him smile instead of ache. Locals returned too. Those who missed the calm of the original shop found comfort in its slower rhythm. The old man with the chessboard, the woman who read poetry in the corner seat. They reclaimed their space, grateful that it had survived the storm of popularity and change. Jacob stood at the window one morning, steaming mug in hand, watching the sun climb behind the rooftops. He wasn't afraid of what came next. Not anymore. This place, small and worn, wasn't his burden. It was his gift, and now it was safe. One afternoon, Amelia returned from a meeting with a gleam in her eyes. "I have one more idea," she said. Jacob raised a brow. "You're not putting a drone in the kitchen, are you?" She grinned. It's something symbolic." She took him outside to the back of the Sky Cafe, where a helipad had been cleared for emergencies and deliveries. In the center, they installed a small bronze bell, polished, modest, mounted on a wooden post. Beneath it, a plaque read, "Ring once for refuge, ring twice for return, ring 3 times for remembrance." It became a quiet tradition. Whenever someone new arrived who looked like they'd walked through a storm, literal or otherwise, Amelia would ring it once. When old customers who had disappeared came back home, they'd ring it twice. And once a month, Jacob rang it 3 times. For his wife, for his younger self, for the girl who'd knocked on his door, soaked in rain, and unknowingly changed everything. The bell's sound was soft, but it carried, and in time people began to wait for it, not as a signal, but as a promise. The years passed gently, the bakery remained, the rooftop cafe thrived, and the legend of a lonely baker, a stranger in the storm, and a cinnamon roll that changed the world spread far and wide. But the truth was quieter, simpler. It wasn't about helicopters or headlines. It was about one door that opened when someone needed shelter, one cinnamon roll that reminded someone what kindness tasted like, one act of warmth that grew into something no one could have predicted. On one unremarkable morning, as clouds loomed again on the horizon, Jacob stood at the counter of Heart and Hearth, shaping dough when the bell above the door chimed. A young man stepped inside, soaked from the drizzle, eyes unsure. Jacob smiled. "No questions," he said, sliding over a warm cinnamon roll. "Just warmth." And the man took a bite, paused, smiled back. Outside, the rain continued. Inside, kindness rose again, software sweet and eternal.